How do you think, both for the developed economies and the emerging economies, the question of jobs, the question of new technologies disrupting the very basis fundamentals of livelihoods is going to pan out? Is that going to be a huge disruption? Memduh, let's start with you.
Sure. When you say technology, it's so huge. Let's talk with the sort of relatively more closer one, the automation bit. Obviously, with the automation, we are expecting a few things. One of them is that the manufacturing export-based growth model that brought up many of the East Asian economies may not be available sort of in the next 15, 20 years. It might be coming to an end. So in that sense, it is a force for deglobalization if parts of the world that are still not part of the global labor system or global economy may not have access to the global system as fast as their counterparts in East Asia. So that would be a dynamic that sort of scares us. And of course, there need to be ways to deal with that, but I think that'll take us too far. It's similarly, what can happen is, of course, with the automation in the Western economies, again, jobs getting lost, and politically, the middle classes and whoever loses their jobs form a political force for deglobalization. So you can get that political dynamic as well. It's again, I'm going back to your title, if we get the ideas and institutions flexible enough to absorb that huge change for the society, I think we'll be fine. I think the democracy will find a way to adopt it, but it really depends on the flexibility and the creativity of our intellectual classes and our institutions.
Neelam, Rohinton, I'd invite you to jump in. David?
I think what we're seeing is the end of a blind romance with technology, in the sense that the large technological companies have had a free pass so far because we were all so enthralled with what they were able to do. The European Union has actually provided some leadership on this in terms of disciplining some of the more Wild West features of the behavior of these companies. I think actually it's something President Trump has also captured a bit. And so I think for the technological companies, things are about to get quite a bit more difficult, and they will come to resemble more classic companies, both nationally and internationally. That's just an intuition, but I think that's the point we're getting to or are at.
So not as disruptive as it is made out to be. Neelam?
I think the impact of technology on manufacturing is actually going to be very disruptive in the developing economies, in emerging economies, because of inadequacies of education and technical skills. But there's one or two other areas which it's important. So because it's going to have such a big impact on the creation of jobs, we need to consider how to deal globally or in smaller groupings, trade in services, which is already more important than manufacturing in trade. More services are now traded than actually commodities. We don't have very satisfactory ways of dealing with trade in services, and the WTO, under which it was being attempted to be addressed, is not functioning very well at the moment. But I think technology has a couple of other aspects that we need to keep in mind. One, of course, is it is affecting already the way in which conflicts play out. So the machine aspects of war have changed already, and so drones are one part of it, but cyber is the other part of it. So the distinction between economic and war, or between civilian and armed forces, has actually been erased. And then, of course, there is the other aspect which impacts democracy perhaps even more, and that is social media.
Rohinton, 1 minute before I throw this open.
I think Memduh and David and Neelam are absolutely right. So first, the big challenge is finding jobs when the low-level jobs will be mechanized. And if you're Ethiopia, this is a big problem. I also think that there is a thesis, antithesis, synthesis going on. And yes, the tech companies have had a free ride. We woke up, and there will be a reaction, and we're seeing it. One or two other points on that. This is not the first time that technology has driven globalization, and that proprietary technology centered in a few countries or in a few firms. That's pretty much the story of the Industrial Revolution as well. And we simply don't know how these things play out, but what we know is that any change happens in a very specific way, and then it spreads. And I don't see that much difference this time. I mean, all the stuff about social media, again, we're catching up. So maybe the last time the bad guys used social media to their advantage. We've learned. Now the good guys will begin harnessing it for various things too. Final point, if there's one thing I'd like to see the world come together on in some way, is to, at the very least, refresh TRIPS, the Intellectual Property Agreement, but actually go beyond TRIPS and think about ways in which technology can spread. And there's lots of models out there. We can come back to that issue. But I think this is where the future is going to be, back to my point about the Industrial Revolution.
So you have heard the think tankers, and actually they are far more positive. They don't think that disruption is really hitting as hard. There are controls in place.